Perhaps some of you are hearing this for the first time, and obviously then we'll look at some of the developments. So I guess the main driving force that has materialized, CMPs, concepts around trackers, issues of consent, and various cases that I'm sure many of on the line are aware of, is predominantly came out of the back of EU cookie law. Particularly, the EU cookie law was first established in a fairly old piece of legislation, the ePrivacy Directive, which again has had a number of amendments, but effectively had its original state in 2002. For those who are familiar with the GDPR, they also may be aware that there was a plan to update the cookie law with a regulation to bring it aligned with the GDPR, and there was intended to be passed at the same time when the GDPR came into force in 2018. That legislation never passed. So in many cases, we have two separate pieces of law. Some member states have done work to reconcile them, but we effectively have two separate pieces of law when we approach privacy and MarTech, AdTech in the EU. We have the cookie law and we have the GDPR. Breach of the cookie law, I suppose, why is this important, at least from a legal and a risk perspective? For those who are familiar with the GDPR fines, well, the vast majority of member states, with the notable exception of the United Kingdom, now we're obviously not part of the EU, but we have exactly the same law. Most countries have adapted and aligned compliance and fining under their cookie law to that of the GDPR. So the greater of £17.5 million, 20 million euros, or 4% of worldwide turnover, whichever is greater. So the fines are substantial for breaching cookie law. So what is cookie law? Well, the baseline, and I've put it there below, the baseline position is that any person, this is a business in this context, shan't store or gain access to information stored on terminal equipment of a subscriber unless requirements are made. The requirement being that their individual has clear and comprehensive information about the means and purposes of that storage and what that information will be used for, and that they give their consent. Now, there are many exemptions and caveats to that, which we'll go on to, but effectively, you need consent for cookies. The last thing to bear in mind is I mentioned that this attempt, shall we say, to bring in and amend and update cookie law around the same time as the GDPR. Well, even that has not happened. There is a significant degree of jurisprudence which deals with the interplay between the ePrivacy Directive and the GDPR. The key issues for the compliance professionals on the line to be aware of is that point one, consent under cookie law, which was never consent as we understand consent under the GDPR, given that they were dealing with a 2002 law, is now the GDPR test for consent. So that's specific and informed and unambiguous intentions of the user. The second point to bear in mind is when we are dealing with personal data in the EU, we talk about the lawful basis for processing. A business regulating the GDPR needs to have a reason, a lawful reason for processing that data. Many businesses are very familiar with legitimate interests. Others will be familiar with consent. Well, the line is where, because consent is required for the purpose of cookies, the interplay between the two is that if you have consent under the PECAs or the ePrivacy Directive, you also need to have consent under the GDPR, which has caused quite a lot of issues. And we've had a series of cases around whether legitimate interests can work hand in hand with the use of cookies. But the current line that the regulators take at the moment is it is consent. So how does that materialize? How does that manifest itself in what a cookie pop-up looks like and what is it trying to gain? So effectively, the position is you must obtain consent from the user for any non-essential or non-strictly necessary, depending on which language you use, non-essential cookies. Typical types being cookies that are used for analytical purposes, cookies that are used for targeting and marketing purposes, cookies that are used to allow social media plugins, for example. You need to tell individuals that you are using cookies and what cookies you're using. That extends and includes strictly necessary cookies and session cookies. For those who are aware, session cookies are not subject to the consent requirements. Strictly necessary cookies. What is a strictly necessary cookie? Well, the typical view is a strictly necessary cookie or essential cookie is any cookie that is used either to deliver a service specifically requested by the user, or it's part of that overarching operation of your website. That includes things like load balancing cookies, cookies that are designed for integrity or to allow access to secure parts of the website, and fundamentally, the cookie that remembers someone's cookie preferences. You don't need consent for those types of cookies. It goes without saying that regulators in the EU are very adamant that cookies should not be dropped unless an interaction with the banner has been made, effectively, unless someone has said, yes, I want this. And consent management platforms, and I know we've obviously got the Trust Out folks on the line to kind of give an overview of what that looks like. The regulators with regards to CMPs, there's clearly been a lot of harmonization around what CMPs do, and the users are starting to understand, the consumers are starting to understand more about CMPs. Regulators make it very clear that the CMP module and the functionality available under a CMP to allow a user to determine their choices, that needs to be clearly signposted on a website. The last two things to mention around consent capture is around the accept all button. I've seen many consent banners through my advice with clients, and it always comes up, well, do we need to have a reject all? Do we need to have a refuse all? There are many different approaches out there. All I can say is that the enforcement action, the regulatory scrutiny, as it suggests, says that if you have an accept all, you should have a refuse all. And there are just a couple of fines, and they are fairly punchy fines for the EU, and there are others of where that has specifically been a finable point within a case brought by a regulator. Those particular cases with a French regulator. And the last thing to bear in mind is the EU, particularly with its latest legislation geared on consumer protection, which I'll mention briefly, and I think Pap on the line is going to talk about a Google manifestation of some of this consumer legislation. There is this concept of what we call dark patterns or nudge tactics. This is the aim of designing your banner or designing your UI in such a way as to solicit a response that maybe benefits you, but not necessarily benefits the user. Classic example being you put accept in green and you put reject in red, for example. The European regulators have wisened up to this habit. And to be clear, anything that can be construed as clearly a dark pattern or a nudge tactic is unlikely to be compliant. That being said, this aspect of A/B testing to determine what necessarily may give you your best subscription opt-in rate, that is not necessarily frowned upon, as long as, again, what you're doing is not necessarily a dark pattern. So what's coming down the line? So I'm going to whiz through this slide because there's quite a lot of detail here behind the bullets, but effectively there's a lot of regulatory scrutiny, unsurprisingly, around personalized marketing and targeting activities at the moment. The position being that, at least in the entire ad tech stack, from publisher all the way through to advertiser, there really isn't an excuse, as the regulators would say, for getting your cookie banner, your use of cookies, your compliance around cookies in order. We've had some significant cases recently. We had a case, the Meta case, as we call it, which put to bed that position that I said around, can you rely on legitimate interests versus consent? It's consent. We had a large fine against a very notable ad tech provider that was specifically around the onus that if you are we're talking about third-party cookies. If you are asking or requesting a website to put cookies to place a cookie on your behalf, you still have an obligation to ensure that they get the consent on your behalf. And there was a fine decision there. And for those who are familiar with IAB's TCF, the Transparency Consent Framework, very, very popular for IAB members and certain ad tech powered bidding. Again, we had some tweaks to how the IAB consent framework works. Again, predominantly moving certain legitimate interest-based options to consent. I mentioned dark patterns. Well, the EDPB, the European Data Protection Board, for those who are not familiar, it's not a super regulator, but it's effectively a body that makes up all of the respective privacy authorities in the EU. They publish guidance. We call it guidance, but it's effectively writ. And they had a task force not too long ago, last year, if I recall, where they basically looked at cookie banners and cookie practices. They talk about dark patterns in there quite a lot. That will give you, there's a lot of guidance in there around what they expect certain approaches to be cookies, where do you draw the line between what is a strictly necessary cookie and what isn't. And regulatory action has really started to kind of cascade down as regulators have really started to kind of get a handle on cookies and CMPs particularly. So obviously there is quite a lot of non-government organizational action. For those who are familiar with Max Schrems and his organization, None of Your Business, NOIB, there's been quite a lot of NGO-led action, usually targeting larger websites around their cookie compliance practices. But even in the UK, in my home jurisdiction, our regulator, the ICO, issued what it called the Cookie Challenge, effectively going through the Alexa rankings, what are the top 100 websites, sending out compliance letters to them, moving on to the next, and so on and so forth. So this is the kind of scrutiny that's starting to ramp up in the EU. The other thing I mentioned is about websites. So there's often this aspect of, particularly in a third-party cookie scenario, where a website or a publisher, as we would call them, goes, well, I'm not necessarily responsible for how this particular pixel works or what happens to my data. I'm somewhat at the behest of the ad tech vendor. Well, unfortunately, that's not the case, at least in the eyes of the regulator. We had very recently a fine in Sweden. A large pharmaceutical company was fined around 3.5 million, so a smaller fine, but they were fined through basically for passing data to Meta without appropriate consent, irrespective of whether they knew or had control of what Meta was or wasn't doing with the data. So the point is the compliance and the exposure hits at all parts of the ad tech chain. And then the last thing to probably mention is I mentioned this consumer piece of legislation coming down the line. We have what's called the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. So again, acknowledging that the ad tech space is made up of quite a large number of big tech players, particularly some of the large platforms, and we're great to have Pap on the line to talk from the Google side. What the regulator is looking to do is, from a consumer perspective, is to bake in some of these privacy requirements straight into that legislation itself. So basically forcing the online platforms to almost ensure that the customers it contracts with are all playing by the same rules. So again, Pat may talk about a manifestation of that, but we have the DMA.